All right, we're into the Good and Beautiful Community, Chapter 7, the Generous Community. And thinking about this, we've talked a lot here at Westminster about being a generous people. And what does that mean? In fact, our slogan is joyful generosity. But it's based on the fact that God's given us so much that God calls us then to be a generous people. So we want to delve into that today and try to figure out what that means. I remember years ago being a youth pastor in Southern California. We weren't that far from World Vision headquarters, which was in Southern California at that time. And World Vision had put together an assimilation game that was to demonstrate in a youth group, what world hunger was like. And so I remember that we divided up into countries. Each country got a certain amount of food, which was represented by an allotment of rice. They also were given some currency, like some coins that they could use. And basically about every 3 minutes or so, they would barter back and forth to try to get more food or more money. And then there would be a gong that would chime. And when it did, they had to pay something to like all the different nations. And I remember we were having fun with this until about 8 minutes into the game, all of a sudden, one of the countries didn't have enough food, and it simulated that it starved to death. And at that point, there was a very different feel to this game. When we're talking about this whole idea of being generous, one of the things we're talking about is that the reality of how we are stewards of things, and also the false and true narratives behind our ability to get things, but also to give things. So remember in this chapter, Smith gives 3 false narratives, and then he gives 3 true narratives. And that's where we want to spend the bulk of our conversation in your small group today. Those 3 false narratives are these. Number 1, God helps those who help themselves. And Smith talks about how that was coined by Benjamin Franklin, who was a deist, and basically says that the bottom line behind this narrative is it says it's their fault. If they're poor or if they don't have what they need, it's their fault. So that was number 1. Number 2, if I give away something that I have, then I'll have less. And that's the second false narrative. And he said that that was a narrative that sort of surfaces or comes out of a sense of scarcity. The third false narrative is that what I have is mine to use for my own pleasure. And Smith talks about that as being a narrative that's formed around the idea of entitlement. So these false narratives we can see are the kinds of things that if you really latch onto them, then you have a hard time understanding what stewardship's about. You tend to think that stewardship is really just something for you and not something that you're responsible for managing on behalf of those who may not have. So in contrast to that, Smith says that the true narratives are these things. Number 1, God helps those who cannot help themselves. And we see that all over the place. I mean, take a breath. We don't own the air, but God provides it. Or, our hearts are beating. That we have this gift of life that we never did anything to earn, but God just freely gives it to us, gives it to all people. So, God does help those who can't help themselves. And we see this especially in Jesus, who comes to do for us what we could never do for ourselves by dying on the cross and bringing forgiveness to us. So that's the first one. Number 2 is this, that if we all share what we have, then there will be enough. And he gives as an illustration of that the manna in the wilderness, which I think would be good for you to talk about in your group. People couldn't take too much of that manna or it rotted. And so it was really meant to be enough for the whole community. And there's that question again, like, do we really have enough in this world? But certain groups are getting more than others. One of the things in the study guide that I thought was really fascinating was that he does a kind of simulation game where you figure out, who has the money, who has the food, and basically about 80% of the world's population is poor, and only about 20% is rich. But 86% of that 80% or 86% of the food in the world goes to the 20%, and 14% of the food goes to the 80%. So, you start to think about those numbers, and it's just staggering in terms of thinking about the poverty and the food issues and hunger issues and homelessness and everything else. So the second thing is, if we share, we'll have enough. And then the third one is, what I have is God's. It belongs to God. So I'm going to use it for God's glory. And in doing that, then we look at the whole issue of stewardship. There's a quote on page 152 about this hunger issue, and Smith says that hunger experts tell us that there is enough food on the planet to end world hunger, but some, mostly in the Western developed world, consume more than they need, which leaves less for the others. I think that's a true statement. In fact, if you ever have a chance to research, food and look at what happens, especially here in the United States, I've often heard that if we were to cut our cattle production and use what we use to feed cattle, develop food for people instead of for cattle, that we could feed the world. So I think there's some real issues there that we need to look at. And of course, Smith gives this funny sort of disconnect where one night he's up watching TV really late and he comes across this weight loss program that for $150 a month or $5 a day, he could lose weight, and he could be on this program and reduce weight, for whatever reason. But then he switches to a relief organization, and it shows that for just $3 a day, you could feed a child. And he just finds that so ironic, it catches him up. And I think it should catch us up. I mean, if we're living in an overfed country, and we would spend more money on losing weight than we would on helping children who need food, it's something that we need to think about. So this whole idea of generosity, I think, has to hit us sort of at the core of our being. And we have to ask the question, what does it mean to be a generous people? He does quote Shane Claiborne, which is fun because we've had Shane here before at Westminster. But Shane says this, he says, we need a third way. It's neither the prosperity gospel, which by the way is like, God will give us everything, or the poverty gospel, which is like we won't get anything, but rather a gospel of abundance that's rooted in a theology of enough. So what does it mean to have a gospel of abundance that's rooted in a theology of enough? This is where Smith starts to talk about being stewards. And he talks not just about stewards in terms of our money, but in terms of our whole life. And this, by the way, is a very biblical principle. We're stewards of our soul. We're stewards of our body. We're stewards of our talents. We're stewards of our time. And we're also stewards of our treasure. And one of the things that he brings out in this is a concept that I love. It's called margin. And margin is the concept of how do we keep from using everything we have so that we can respond in ways that are important. Let me give you a couple of illustrations. One is that every page has a margin on the side. It's sort of where the writing ends and there's a space there. But think with me about this because, see, margin appears in other ways as well. Like, for example, a financial margin means that you're not living from paycheck to paycheck, but you have something you can fall back on if there's an emergency. A margin with time means that you're not just running from one appointment to the other, or you're mad on the road because you've been slowed down a little bit and you were planning to the second to arrive at your destination. Having margin means that you allow extra minutes in case something happens. Today, by and large, margin has sort of been cut out of people's lives. And I think it's part of what leads to some of the anger that bubbles up sometimes. Because we're just running from one thing to another. And, life was never meant to be this great big race to the very end and then you die. It was meant to be something that you enjoy, and there's a rhythm to it and an ability to move along at a pace that makes sense for you so that you can really be present in the moment and enjoy life. So this idea of being generous and of being stewards helps to frame that as well. Spiritual disciplines themselves, the purpose of a spiritual discipline is to create some space where you can hear from God, where you can be with God. So a discipline is another way of creating some margin. How do we do that? Well, let me give you a couple of thoughts this week. I think one is, think about how you could create some margin with time. And one of the ways that we do that is by simply saying no to people. The great thing about that is when you say no to something, then you can also say yes to something that you really want to do. So saying no actually gives us the opportunity to say yes to the right things. Or maybe, it's with your talent. You're talented at something, you're good at something, you're gifted, but maybe you have to say to somebody, no, I'm not available to do that for you right now. Let me look ahead and figure out a time you can do it. Having talents doesn't mean we have to be available all the time. Or, for example, he gives the idea with treasure of being frugal. Can you cut back? Because when you cut back in certain ways, then you're actually able to give more in ways that make sense for you. So this whole way of looking at margin is a kind of plan for becoming a generous community. We can learn the joy of living, but we can also learn the way to have margin together. Here's a great quote by Dallas Willard, and I'll end with this. He says about frugality, he says, practicing frugality means we stay within the bounds of what general good judgment would designate as necessary for the kind of life to which God has led us. So you see, having margin is a kind of boundary also. And when we have those boundaries, then we can live a kind of joyful generosity with those that are around us. Smith ends this by saying, you got to realize that this time that we have here on earth, this is our time to be stewards. And we can't do it later. So there's a challenge in that to be good stewards now. So God bless you as your group meets, and I pray that you have a great conversation about being a generous community together.